The rain fell like bullets against the windshield, each drop exploding into fractured light as the black sedan cut through Charleston's flooded streets at midnight. Behind the wheel, a man whose name made grown men whisper sat in absolute silence, his knuckles white against leather as thunder split the sky above the industrial district. The meeting had gone poorly. Blood would follow by morning, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating routes and consequences with mechanical precision. His headlights swept across abandoned warehouses when something impossible appeared in the beam. A small figure standing motionless in the deluge, water streaming down a pink dress turned gray by rain. The man's foot hit the brake instinctively, the car hydroplaning briefly before stopping 20 feet from the child who hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched at the approaching vehicle. She clutched a teddy bear against her chest, its fur matted and dripping, her dark hair plastered to a face too calm for a child alone in a storm. He sat frozen, engine idling, windshield wipers beating their rhythmic pulse as he studied her through the distorted glass. Every instinct screamed danger. A setup, a trap, something designed to catch a man who'd survived 2 decades by trusting nothing. But the girl simply stood there, barefoot on cracked asphalt, her lips moving in words he couldn't hear over the rain's assault. Against every rule he'd built his empire on, he opened the door and stepped into the storm, cold water instantly soaking through his suit. The child watched him approach with eyes that held no fear, only a devastating exhaustion that made his chest tighten inexplicably. When he crouched before her, bringing his face level with hers, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, but clear as glass. "Mama went to get medicine," she said, her Portuguese accent soft and lilting despite the tremor in her small frame. She said, "Wait by the blue door," but the door is gone now. Her fingers tightened on the bear's worn paw, water running in rivulets down her arms. He looked past her at the demolished building behind them, its blue door now splinters on the ground, bullet holes decorating the surrounding brick in patterns he recognized. His jaw clenched as realization crept in. This was the site of tonight's territorial dispute, the warehouse his men had cleared 3 hours ago. The chronology arranged itself in his mind with sickening clarity, each piece locking into place like a verdict he couldn't appeal. "How long have you been here?" His voice came out rougher than intended, unused to addressing anyone so small, so breakable. She tilted her head, considering the question with an adult seriousness that didn't belong on a 6-year-old face. "The sun went away 2 times, she answered, holding up 2 fingers, water dripping from her small hand. He stood abruptly, scanning the empty street for any sign of surveillance or witnesses, his mind already racing through options. Leaving her meant certain death from exposure or worse, the predators who hunted these abandoned blocks. Calling authorities meant questions he couldn't answer, attention he couldn't afford. Taking her crossed a line he'd never approached, introducing chaos into a life built on rigid control and emotional distance. The girl swayed slightly, her legs buckling before she caught herself, and the decision made itself without his permission. He removed his suit jacket despite the rain and wrapped it around her shoulders, the expensive fabric swallowing her tiny frame. She looked up at him with those exhausted eyes, and did something that cracked something in his chest. She smiled, small and trusting and completely undeserved. "What's your name?" he asked, lifting her into his arms where she weighed almost nothing, her cold skin raising alarm bells about hypothermia and time running out. She laid her head against his shoulder with immediate trust that felt like an indictment. "Isabella," she whispered, her breath warm against his neck, like the princess, then quieter, almost lost in the rain. "Are you taking me to Mama?" He didn't answer because there was no answer that wouldn't be a lie, and something about this child made him reluctant to add deception to the list of sins already accumulating. Instead, he carried her to the sedan, settling her in the back seat where she curled into a ball, still clutching the bear. His phone buzzed with messages he ignored, starting the engine and pulling away from the scene of devastation he'd orchestrated without knowing its full cost. The drive to his estate took 20 minutes through empty streets, the storm providing cover as he passed through checkpoints where guards snapped to attention. They froze at the sight of the small passenger wrapped in his jacket, confusion flickering across trained faces. Before discipline reasserted control, he offered no explanations, his expression daring anyone to question as he carried Isabella through the front entrance, water trailing across marble floors that had never seen mud or innocence. The mansion swallowed them in silence, 30 rooms of cold perfection, where his footsteps echoed like judgments against polished stone. Crystal chandeliers hung motionless overhead, their light reflecting off surfaces maintained by staff who knew better than to ask questions about their employer's private business. He climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, choosing the guest wing that had remained unused since he'd purchased the property 5 years ago. The hallway stretched before them, lined with closed doors, hiding rooms decorated by professionals who'd never been asked about comfort, only about projecting wealth and power. The room he selected faced east, its windows offering morning light that might comfort a child, though he had no real knowledge of what children needed. Heavy curtains framed glass that overlooked manicured gardens where no one ever walked, beauty maintained as display rather than sanctuary. Isabella stirred as he laid her on the bed, her eyes opening briefly to scan the unfamiliar surroundings with quick, assessing movements that spoke of survival instincts already formed. The bedspread beneath her was ivory silk, expensive and impractical, chosen by a decorator who'd never considered it might hold a rain-soaked child. He stepped back, suddenly uncertain about basic logistics. Should he remove her wet clothes, leave her shoes on the pristine fabric, wake her for food she probably needed? His expertise lay in reading men's intentions and orchestrating violence, not caring for a 6-year-old who'd lost everything because of orders he'd given. The teddy bear slipped from her grip as exhaustion reclaimed her, falling against the pillow where its button eyes stared accusingly. He picked it up carefully, surprised by how worn it felt. How many hands must have held it before tonight? The fur was matted beyond saving, one ear hanging by threads, but Isabella had clutched it through the storm like it was made of gold. He placed it back in her loosening fingers, watching her hand automatically tighten around it, even in sleep. Outside, lightning illuminated the room in brief flashes, and he noticed details he'd missed before. A small bruise on her wrist, dirt under her fingernails, the way she curled into herself as if making her body as small as possible. Standing in the doorway, he watched her small chest rise and fall with the shallow breaths of someone too exhausted to fully rest. His phone buzzed again, his second in command demanding updates on the evening's business, decisions that required his attention, the machinery of his empire grinding forward with its usual ruthless efficiency. He silenced it completely, unable to reconcile the violence of his world with the sleeping child who'd entered it by accident of geography and timing. The weight of what he'd done, what his orders had set in motion, settled on his shoulders like physical mass pressing down on bones that had carried guilt before, but never quite like this. Somewhere in this city, a woman lay dead or dying, her last thoughts probably of the daughter waiting by a blue door that no longer existed. His hands had pulled that trigger as surely as if he'd been present, and now that same daughter slept in his house, saved by the man who'd destroyed her world. He pulled the door partially closed, leaving it open enough to hear if she woke, then stood in the hallway, as water dripped from his clothes onto antique rugs, worth more than most people earned in a year. His reflection stared back from a gilt mirror, a man approaching 30 who looked older, whose eyes held calculations instead of warmth. The face that had intimidated rivals and silenced rooms now seemed foreign, wearing an expression he didn't recognize as his own. For the first time in a decade, he felt something uncomfortably close to shame, a sensation he'd trained himself to bury under justifications about territory and business and the brutal logic of survival. But standing in this hallway with a child's presence disrupting the careful order of his life, those justifications felt hollow as the mansion's unused rooms. He moved to the window at the hall's end, pressing his palm against glass cold from the storm outside, watching rain streak down in patterns that blurred the world beyond. His empire was built on the rubble of lives like Isabella's. He'd always known this in abstract terms, numbers on reports about collateral damage and acceptable losses. But abstract became concrete when it slept in your guest room wearing a ruined pink dress, clutching a bear that couldn't protect her from anything that mattered. Morning would bring impossible questions and decisions he wasn't equipped to make, but one truth crystallized with absolute certainty as he stood guard over a child who shouldn't trust him. The storm had brought him more than a lost girl. It had brought a reckoning he could no longer outrun, carried on the small shoulders of someone who'd done nothing wrong, except wait by a door that his world had destroyed. The night stretched ahead with the weight of consequences finally arriving after years of outrunning them. He settled against the wall outside Isabella's room, sitting on the floor in his wetsuit like a sentry who'd arrived too late to prevent the damage, but refused to abandon the post anyway. Dawn arrived without permission, pale light filtering through storm clouds that hadn't cleared, painting the mansion in shades of gray that matched the exhaustion pressing behind his eyes. He'd spent the night in the hallway outside Isabella's room, listening to her restless sleep, punctuated by whimpers that made his jaw clench against the urge to enter and offer comfort he didn't know how to give. When morning finally broke, he rose with joints stiff from the hard floor and a decision already crystallized. She needed care he couldn't provide, expertise that existed outside his world of enforced loyalty and violent solutions. His second-in-command arrived at 7, with coffee and carefully blank expressions, taking in the boss's rumpled appearance and unusual location without comment or questions. They spoke in low voices about the previous night's operation, casualty reports delivered in clinical terms that suddenly felt obscene with a child sleeping 30 feet away. The numbers had always been abstract before. 2 hostiles neutralized, 3 injured, 1 civilian casualty. Now civilian casualty had a name and a teddy bear, and a mother who'd never return. He cut the briefing short with a single command that made his lieutenant's eyebrows rise in surprise. "Find a nurse," he said, his voice rough from disuse and the weight of sleeplessness. "Someone discreet, someone who won't ask questions we can't answer." His network moved with efficiency, born from years of practice, producing 3 candidates by noon with backgrounds scrubbed clean and prices already negotiated. But only one made him pause when reviewing her file. 6 years at Charleston General Trauma Unit. References praising her competence and discretion in equal measure that suggested experience with situations requiring both. There was something else, though, buried in the notations his people had compiled with their usual thoroughness. 4 years ago, she'd treated a patient with multiple gunshot wounds, stabilized him despite massive blood loss, and filed no police report despite hospital protocol requiring exactly that for gunshot victims. His memory supplied details the file didn't need to state. Her steady hand stitching his shoulder at 3 in the morning, her eyes that had seen too much to pretend shock at the violence written on his body. She'd asked no questions then, worked with focused precision, and accepted cash payment that ensured the entire encounter disappeared from official records. The call was made through intermediaries, an offer extended with enough money to ensure compliance and enough vagueness to maintain deniability on both sides. She agreed within an hour, a speed that suggested either financial desperation or curiosity about why a man like him needed a nurse. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Her motivations were her own. He found himself standing by the second-floor window watching the driveway with unusual nervousness, checking his watch twice before her modest sedan appeared at the gate. The guards performed their security protocols with practiced efficiency, calling ahead for authorization while she waited with visible patience in her driver's seat. She emerged carrying a leather medical bag that looked older than her career, its worn surface suggesting years of use in situations that required house calls rather than hospital sterility. Her posture was professionally straight, despite what she must be feeling, walking toward the mansion entrance with the controlled movements of someone entering uncertain territory. The security guard at the door spoke briefly into his radio before admitting her, and through the window, he watched her pause in the foyer, taking in the marble columns and crystal chandelier with an expression carefully arranged into neutrality. Then she looked up, directly at the second-floor window where he stood, and for 3 seconds their eyes met across the distance. Recognition flashed between them like a current completing a circuit. Acknowledgement of shared history neither would voice aloud. He moved to the staircase, descending with measured steps as she waited below, her hands clasped around the bag's handle with white knuckles that betrayed tension her face refused to show. Up close, she looked exactly as he remembered. Dark hair pulled back severely, minimal makeup that spoke of practicality over vanity, eyes the color of coffee that missed nothing in their systematic assessment of everything they observed. She wore scrubs under a practical jacket, prepared for work, rather than impressed by surroundings designed to intimidate through displays of wealth. "Thank you for coming," he said, the words formal and insufficient for the situation's strangeness, for the weight of what he was asking without actually asking. She nodded once, professionally, her face carefully arranged into neutrality that he recognized as deliberate construction rather than natural expression. "Your associate said there's a child who needs medical attention," she replied, her voice lower than he remembered, textured with something between caution and determination. "I'll need to examine her privately, assess what care is required." The statement was professional boundary setting, establishing her authority in the one area where his power meant nothing. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and he knew she recognized him despite the years and changed context, despite every reason both had to pretend otherwise. Her next breath came slightly faster, a tell so subtle most would miss it, before her professional mask reasserted itself with visible effort. Neither acknowledged the recognition explicitly. She, from self-preservation instinct honed in a city where knowing too much meant danger. Him, from respect for the fiction that protected them both from uncomfortable truths. "She's upstairs," he said, gesturing toward the staircase they would climb together, entering territory where his control meant nothing against her medical expertise and professional judgment. "She was caught in last night's storm, possibly for 2 days based on what she told me. Exposure, possible fever, emotional trauma." The clinical terms felt wrong in his mouth, reducing Isabella's suffering to symptoms, while the cause remained unspoken between them, like a body neither wanted to acknowledge. She preceded him up the stairs, her footsteps quiet against marble that amplified every sound in the mansion's careful silence. He found himself watching the set of her shoulders, ready for anything, afraid of everything, carrying herself with the controlled tension of someone walking into a situation they couldn't fully assess yet. At the top, he led her down the hallway where morning light painted rectangles on walls decorated with art he'd never chosen, stopping outside the room where Isabella still slept. Through the partially open door, they could see her curled beneath blankets he'd added during the night, checking on her every hour like a watchman guarding something precious and fragile. The teddy bear's head was visible on the pillow, its button eyes catching light from the window. "What's her name?" the nurse asked, her hand on the doorframe, preparing to enter a space where his presence would be intrusion rather than authority, where her knowledge would govern what happened next. "Isabella," he answered, then added what he hadn't told his men, trusting her with information that felt dangerous to speak aloud. Her mother didn't come back for her. The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither would voice directly, before she pushed the door open and stepped into the room. He remained in the doorway, watching as she approached the bed with movements calibrated to avoid startling a traumatized child who might wake disoriented and afraid. Isabella's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to fear as consciousness returned, and she remembered she wasn't home, wasn't anywhere familiar or safe. But the nurse smiled, warm and genuine, and completely different from her guarded expression in the hallway moments before. She spoke in Portuguese, low and musical, words he couldn't understand but recognized from Isabella's accent last night. The girl's body visibly relaxed, as language connected her to something familiar in this strange place. The examination began with gentle hands checking temperature, by pressing the back of her hand to Isabella's forehead, then feeling for swollen glands along her neck with fingers that moved with practiced efficiency. She maintained a stream of soft conversation in Portuguese that kept Isabella calm, occasionally making the girl smile at something said in a tone that transcended language barriers. He observed from his position at the threshold, noting how the nurse's fingers trembled almost imperceptibly when checking Isabella's wrists and arms for injuries beyond simple exposure. Her jaw tightened when she discovered the small bruise he'd noticed last night, her touch becoming even gentler as she examined it with professional care that somehow conveyed both competence and compassion. She produced a stethoscope from her bag, warming the metal between her palms before pressing it to Isabella's chest, a small gesture of consideration he wouldn't have thought about, but that made the child relax further. The nurse listened with absolute focus, moving the instrument to different positions while counting breaths and heartbeats with internal rhythm he couldn't track. 20 minutes passed in careful assessment, each action deliberate and thorough, as she checked reflexes, looked into Isabella's throat with a small light, examined her feet for cuts or infections from walking barefoot. She asked questions in Portuguese that prompted short answers, and though he couldn't understand the words, he could read the concern deepening in the nurse's expression with each response. Finally, she straightened, one hand resting on Isabella's shoulder in reassurance while her eyes found his across the room. Her expression had shifted into something more complex, professional concern layered with questions she couldn't ask, and anger she couldn't express without knowing how much honesty this situation could bear, without shattering its fragile equilibrium. She gestured toward the hallway with a slight tilt of her head, a silent request for private conversation that he granted by stepping back. Isabella watched them both with large eyes that tracked movement with wariness, born from experience he wished she didn't have, clutching her teddy bear tighter as the nurse promised in Portuguese that she'd return in just a moment. In the corridor with the door pulled nearly closed, she faced him with arms crossed defensively across her chest, her voice low but sharp as a scalpel cutting through pretense. Low-grade fever, dehydration, early signs of pneumonia from prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. She needs rest, fluids, monitoring for the next 72 hours minimum to ensure the infection doesn't progress. A pause waited with everything unsaid, with the medical facts she could state, and the human reality she had to acknowledge without specific accusation. She's been through severe trauma. The physical symptoms are treatable with basic care, but emotionally she's barely holding together. She keeps asking when her mother is coming back. What does she need? He asked, the question encompassing more than medicine, acknowledging the vastness of his ignorance about caring for anything so fragile and damaged. The nurse studied his face as if reading a diagnosis written in the lines around his eyes, and the tension in his jaw, searching for something she either found or decided to pretend existed. Constant supervision by someone who knows pediatric care protocols, proper nutrition, and most importantly, stability and safety while she processes whatever happened to her. The implication settled between them like a challenge he couldn't refuse. Could his world provide any of those things to a child who'd already lost everything? His phone buzzed in his pocket with business requiring attention, violence requiring authorization, the machinery of his empire demanding he return to being the man who'd caused this situation through orders given without thought to civilian casualties in abandoned districts. Instead, he looked at the nurse whose name he suddenly needed to know and asked the question that would change everything. Will you stay? Her eyes widened fractionally, surprise breaking through professional composure before she recovered with visible effort. I have shifts at the hospital, responsibilities to patients who depend on regular care. He interrupted with the bluntness that moved his world and shaped reality to his requirements. Name your price. Whatever it takes to keep you here. Money was meaningless to him beyond its utility as a tool, but her presence felt suddenly essential, the only stable point in chaos he'd created and couldn't control through usual methods. She looked away, toward the door where Isabella waited, and he watched the decision form in the tightness around her mouth, in the way her fingers uncrossed and recrossed over her chest. When she met his eyes again, hers held something between resignation and determination, the look of someone accepting a situation against their better judgment. 1 week, she said firmly, establishing boundaries he sensed she needed more than him, drawing lines that would define how this arrangement could possibly work. I'll need supplies, a proper setup for extended pediatric care, and complete access to the child without interference from you or your people. Done, he agreed immediately, relief tasting unfamiliar on his tongue like a flavor he'd forgotten existed beyond business negotiations and territorial agreements. There's another bedroom in this wing. Take whatever space you need, whatever resources make this work. She nodded, already turning back toward Isabella's room, but paused with her hand on the door. I need your assurance she's safe here, she said without looking at him, the words carrying weight beyond their surface, meaning asking for guarantees about things neither could fully control. From everyone, from everything. If I'm staying, if I'm providing care, I need to know she won't be used as leverage or caught in whatever business you conduct. He understood what she was really asking. For a sanctuary carved from violence. For rules applied to someone who usually made the rules rather than following them. You have my word, he said, and watched her shoulders tense because they both knew what his word meant in certain contexts and how little it might mean in others. No one touches her, no one questions her, no one even looks at her wrong. She turned then, studying his face with an intensity that felt like exposure, like being seen by someone who recognized the monster, but was choosing to negotiate with it anyway. I'll hold you to that, she said quietly, then pushed into the room where Isabella waited, leaving him in the hallway with a promise he intended to keep even if it meant going to war with his own organization. He descended to the first floor where his second-in-command waited with a tablet full of situations, requiring decisions and approvals. They moved to his office, a room of dark wood and leather that smelled of expensive cigars and older money, where he issued orders with distracted efficiency, his mind partly on business and partly on the child sleeping upstairs. Double the security on the estate's perimeter, he instructed, signing documents without reading them as thoroughly as usual, trusting his lieutenant's judgment in ways he rarely did. No one enters without my explicit authorization. No exceptions for anyone regardless of rank or relationship. And send someone to purchase children's clothes, appropriate for a 6-year-old girl. His second-in-command's expression remained professionally neutral, but questions lived in the slight pause before he responded. Size? Preferences? Style? The practical inquiry highlighted how little they knew about this situation, how far outside normal operations this had strayed already in less than 12 hours. I don't know, he admitted, the words tasting like failure in a life built on always having answers and solutions. Ask the nurse. She'll know what's needed. And food. Whatever children eat, that's not what we normally stock here. The mansion's kitchen was designed for catering formal dinners and preparing meals for a single man with simple tastes, not nourishing a traumatized child back to health. His lieutenant made notes on the tablet, asking no questions about why or how long, understanding that some situations develop their own momentum beyond planning. The warehouse from last night, he continued, changing subjects to business that felt simultaneously more urgent and less important than before. What's the final count on casualties? What are we looking at for cleanup? The report came in clipped professional terms. 2 rival operators eliminated, 3 wounded and retreating from the territory, structural damage contained to the single building they'd targeted, and 1 civilian casualty, a woman found in the alley behind the warehouse, dead from exposure and injuries sustained during the firefight that had destroyed the area. The words hit differently now that he'd held her daughter, now that Isabella's face had put human features on the abstract concept of collateral damage. Was she identified? He asked, needing to know even though the answer wouldn't change anything, wouldn't bring back the mother who'd gone for medicine and walked into a war zone. No ID on the body, no missing persons report filed yet, no family coming forward to claim her. His lieutenant delivered the information without emotion, just facts that would normally be footnotes in a larger operation's success. She's at the city morgue as a Jane Doe pending identification, probably gets buried in a potter's field if no one claims her within 30 days. He thought of Isabella asking when her mother would return, thought of that inevitable conversation when eventually someone would have to tell her the truth. Keep monitoring the situation, he said, unable to articulate why it mattered, what difference it made to track a dead woman's journey through the system. Let me know if anyone comes looking, if any family surfaces. The meeting continued through other business. Territory secured, rivals retreating, profits flowing as expected. But his attention kept drifting upstairs where a nurse worked to save what he'd helped destroy. When his lieutenant finally left, he sat alone in the office, watching rain begin again outside, wondering when exactly he'd crossed the line from ruthless to something he didn't have words for yet. Upstairs, the nurse had transformed Isabella's room into a makeshift medical suite with efficiency that spoke of experience working in less than ideal conditions. An IV stand borrowed from her car's emergency supplies dripped fluids into Isabella's small arm, held in place with tape and steady hands that made the child barely flinch during insertion. She'd opened curtains to let in gray daylight, stripped the wet clothes Isabella had worn since the storm, and replaced them with a t-shirt clearly borrowed from somewhere in the mansion. The teddy bear sat on the nightstand, positioned where the girl could see it while resting against pillows, arranged to help her breathe easier despite congested lungs. The nurse worked with quiet competence, checking vitals every 30 minutes, and noting results in a small notebook she'd produced from her bag. She spoke to Isabella in Portuguese during each check, maintaining a gentle stream of conversation that seemed designed as much to comfort as to assess the child's mental state alongside her physical condition. He appeared in the doorway an hour later, carrying the supplies his people had acquired with remarkable speed. Children's clothing in multiple sizes, soft foods and drinks appropriate for a sick child, even a new stuffed animal that seemed presumptuous, given the beloved bear already present. The nurse looked up from adjusting Isabella's IV, and something in her expression softened fractionally at his awkward attempt to help. "Leave them there," she said, gesturing to a chair near the door, and he obeyed with unusual meekness, setting down bags and backing away like he was afraid of contaminating the space with his presence. Isabella watched him with those assessing eyes, and he wondered what she saw. Savior or something more complicated that her 6-year-old mind couldn't yet articulate. Days blurred together in a routine that felt foreign in a house built for solitude and careful control, rather than the chaos of caring for a sick child. The nurse, whose name he'd learned was Nina during a brief exchange about medical supply deliveries, moved through the mansion with increasing familiarity, no longer hesitating at doorways or asking permission to access the kitchen at odd hours. She prepared meals for Isabella with ingredients his staff procured from lists written in neat handwriting, soups and soft foods that wouldn't tax a system fighting infection. The industrial kitchen designed for caterers and formal dinners filled with smells he didn't recognize, herbs and broths simmering on stoves that had rarely been used for anything so simple or necessary as feeding a child. He found himself drawn to that wing of the house during hours when he should have been sleeping, standing outside Isabella's door, listening to Nina sing lullabies in Portuguese that carried through the partial opening. Her voice was untrained but warm, reaching notes that seemed designed to soothe rather than impress, and he caught himself staying longer than reconnaissance required. The third night, Isabella's fever spiked despite treatment, her small body shaking with chills that made Nina's expression tighten with professional concern, masking deeper fear. He stood in the doorway watching as she applied cool compresses and adjusted medications, her movements swift and certain, even as worry showed in the tense set of her shoulders. "Should we take her to a hospital?" he asked, the question revealing his helplessness in situations money and influence couldn't immediately fix. Nina didn't look up from her patient, but her voice carried steady reassurance. "Not yet. This is expected with pneumonia, the body fighting the infection. But if she's not better by morning, yes, we'll need to consider it regardless of complications." The unspoken complications hung in the air. Questions about how this child came to be in his care, scrutiny neither of them could afford, attention that would unravel the fragile protection he'd extended. He nodded and withdrew, returning to his position in the hallway where he'd spent portions of the last 3 nights. A vigil that made no logical sense but felt necessary anyway. By dawn, the fever had broken, Isabella sleeping peacefully for the first time since arriving, while Nina dozed in a chair pulled close to the bed. He entered quietly with coffee he'd made himself in the unfamiliar kitchen, setting it on the nightstand where she'd see it upon waking. She stirred at the sound, eyes opening to find him standing there, and for a moment neither spoke. "Thank you," she said finally, reaching for the cup with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion, 3 days of round-the-clock care showing in shadows under her eyes. He shook his head, rejecting gratitude that felt misplaced. "You're the one keeping her alive. I just provided the space." But they both knew it was more complicated than that his provision came with weight and cost neither could fully calculate yet. As Isabella's condition improved, Nina began venturing beyond the sick room, exploring the mansion with the careful curiosity of someone cataloging her environment. He'd catch glimpses of her in the library running fingers along book spines, or standing in the solarium where plants grew in careful arrangements no one ever enjoyed, bringing life to spaces that had existed as displays rather than living areas. She started taking her own meals in the breakfast room that overlooked the gardens, sitting at a table meant for 12, but occupied only by her solitary figure. The 4th morning, he found himself joining her without invitation, carrying his coffee to the opposite end like they were strangers sharing public space rather than 2 people cohabiting in unusual circumstances. They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware and the distant sound of Isabella's cartoons playing in her room, something Nina had requested, and he'd had installed within hours, anything to make the child smile. "She's asking about her mother more frequently," Nina said without preamble, addressing the conversation they'd been avoiding since her arrival. "What are you telling her?" he asked, needing to know how much truth Nina was willing to deploy, how she was handling questions that had no good answers, that her mother loves her very much, but can't be here right now, that she's safe here until we figure everything out. The careful wording bought time, but couldn't postpone indefinitely the reckoning waiting for all of them. He set down his cup with deliberate care, the porcelain clicking against the saucer in the quiet room. "Her mother is dead, found behind the warehouse where I picked up Isabella. No identification. No one's claimed the body." The words came out flat, factual, stripped of emotion because feeling it would make continuing impossible. Nina's face went carefully blank. The professional mask she wore when processing information, she couldn't immediately react to settling over her features. "Does Isabella know?" Her voice remained steady through visible effort, maintaining the clinical distance required to function in impossible situations. "Not yet. I thought you should know first. Decide how to tell her or if we should wait until she's stronger." "She deserves the truth," Nina said after a long pause, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup until her knuckles went white, but delivered with care, with support. Not as a fact dropped like you just did with me. The rebuke was gentle but clear, establishing boundaries around how tragedy would be communicated to a child who'd already lost everything. He accepted the criticism with a nod, recognizing his limitations in situations requiring emotional intelligence beyond calculating threats and opportunities. "Will you tell her? You've built trust I don't have," said in a language that's hers. Nina's eyes met his across the table, and he saw her working through the implications of accepting that responsibility, becoming the bearer of devastating news. "Not alone," she finally answered, her voice firm despite the tremor underneath. "We tell her together. You need to be present, to show her that telling the truth doesn't mean abandonment. She needs to see that the man who brought her here is staying, not disappearing when things get difficult. The requirement placed him in a role he'd never auditioned for, never imagined himself capable of filling with any competence. But he nodded agreement, because Nina was right, because avoiding hard conversations was a coward's choice he'd never allowed himself in business, and couldn't start now with stakes this high. They finished breakfast planning how to deliver news that would shatter a child's world. Two people from completely different lives united temporarily by shared responsibility for someone who trusted them both in different ways. That afternoon, they sat on either side of Isabella's bed, where she'd been coloring pictures Nina had provided, crude drawings of houses and families that now felt prophetic. Nina spoke in Portuguese, gentle words that made Isabella's crayon slow, then stop, her small face turning toward the nurse with growing understanding that her 6-year-old mind was trying to reject. He watched the moment her world broke, saw the exact second when hope died in eyes too young to understand permanent loss. She didn't cry immediately, just sat frozen holding a red crayon, her mouth opening and closing without sound, as her brain tried to process information it wasn't developmentally ready to accept. Then the tears came, silent at first, before building into sobs that shook her entire small frame, the kind of crying that had no bottom, no end in sight. Nina gathered her close while he sat paralyzed, watching grief consume someone who'd already survived too much, whose capacity for loss shouldn't have been tested this early or this brutally. Isabella cried into Nina's shoulder for what felt like hours, her small hands fisting in the nurse's shirt like she was afraid of being torn away from this last anchor. He remained on the bed's edge, one hand hovering near Isabella's back, uncertain if touch would comfort or intrude on grief that deserved its full expression without interference from someone who'd caused it. Eventually, the sobs quieted to hiccups, then to exhausted breathing as Isabella's body gave out from the emotional storm. Nina rocked her gently, still murmuring Portuguese words that sounded like prayers or promises, maybe both, while he finally placed his hand on the child's shoulder and felt her lean fractionally into the contact. The days that followed were quieter, heavier, as Isabella processed loss in ways that broke his heart in places he hadn't known still functioned. She stopped asking when her mother would return, but started asking other questions. Where was the body? Could they visit? Did her mother hurt? Was she alone when it happened? Nina fielded these with gentle honesty, never lying but shaping truth into forms a child could carry without being crushed completely. He listened from doorways, learning how to speak about death and loss, from someone whose profession had given her vocabulary for the unspeakable, templates for conversations he'd avoided his entire adult life. But as the second week began, he noticed Nina watching him differently, not with the cautious respect of earlier days, but with something sharper, more assessing. She'd pause when he entered rooms, her eyes tracking his movements with the focus of someone solving a puzzle they didn't particularly want completed but couldn't stop working on. He caught her one afternoon in his study, where she had no reason to be, standing before the wall of photographs he kept as insurance more than memory, images of associates, rivals, business partners arranged in careful groupings that told stories to those who knew how to read them. She turned when she heard him, no guilt in her expression, only questions forming behind eyes that saw too much. "Looking for something?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral, though they both knew she'd crossed a boundary by entering this space without permission. She didn't apologize, instead gesturing to a photograph showing him with his inner circle at some formal function years past. "That man," she said, pointing to his enforcer standing slightly behind him in the image. "I've seen him here, haven't I? Outside the gates when I arrived." The observation was accurate. His enforcer had been rotating through security details since Isabella's arrival, part of the increased protection he'd ordered. "He works for me," he confirmed, offering no additional information, watching her process this fact alongside others she'd been collecting like evidence at a crime scene. "What does he do?" Nina asked, her voice carefully casual in a way that suggested the answer mattered more than she wanted to reveal. "Security," he said, the standard euphemism that covered multitudes of sins while remaining technically accurate. But Nina's expression shifted, something clicking into place behind her eyes that made his chest tighten with anticipation of conclusions he couldn't stop her from reaching. "Does Isabella know him? Has she seen him before you found her?" The question hung between them like an accusation waiting to form fully, and he understood suddenly what Nina was working toward, connections between his world and Isabella's tragedy that went beyond coincidence and timing. "Why are you asking?" His voice came out harder than intended. defensive in ways that would only confirm suspicions instead of deflecting them. Nina held his gaze without flinching, courage or foolishness making her press forward despite clear warning signs. Because yesterday, when he walked past the window, Isabella stopped playing. She didn't say anything, just went very still and watched him until he was out of sight. Then she asked me in Portuguese if the bad men were coming back. The words landed like physical blows, each one connecting to guilt he'd been carrying since the night he'd picked up a rain-soaked child. He moved to the window, needing distance from Nina's penetrating stare, from questions that would unravel everything if followed to their logical conclusions. Outside, his enforcer stood at the gate talking into a radio, the same man who'd cleared that warehouse, who'd created the chaos that killed Isabella's mother and destroyed a child's sense of safety in the world. She was traumatized, he said without turning, offering explanations that felt hollow even as he spoke them. The storm, the violence in that area, she probably saw things that night that would make any man in a suit seem threatening. But Nina wasn't buying the deflection, her footsteps approaching until she stood beside him at the window, both watching the man below. "I'm not stupid," she said quietly, her voice stripped of professional courtesy or cautious deference. "I know what you are, what this place represents, what kind of business requires the security and discretion you maintain. I knew it 4 years ago when I stitched you up, and I know it now." A pause, weighted with choices they were both making in real time. "What I need to understand is how Isabella fits into it." The truth sat on his tongue like poison, that his orders had created her orphan status, that his empire's expansion had demolished her safe place, that the man she feared worked for the person now claiming to protect her. But speaking it aloud would end the fragile peace they'd built, would force Nina to make choices about complicity and morality that would probably result in her leaving and taking any stability Isabella had found with her. "Sometimes bad things happen in my world," he said instead, the coward's version of honesty that admitted nothing while confirming everything. "Sometimes innocent people get caught in situations they shouldn't have been near. I can't change what happened to her mother, can't undo the circumstances that brought Isabella here. I can only try to give her safety now, protection from a world that's already taken everything from her." Nina absorbed this non-answer, her reflection in the window showing conflict playing across her features. The nurse who'd sworn to do no harm, the woman who'd entered a devil's bargain for reasons she probably couldn't fully articulate even to herself. "If she's in danger here," Nina said finally, turning to face him directly, "if anyone in your organization poses a threat to her, I need to know. I can't protect her from dangers I don't understand." He met her eyes, seeing the determination there alongside fear she was trying to hide, and made a decision that would reshape his relationship with his own people. "She's under my protection. That means untouchable by anyone, regardless of rank or relationship to me. But you're right to be cautious, right to watch for threats." A breath, committing to something he couldn't take back. "Keep observing. Keep noting what makes her afraid. If someone in my organization is a problem, I need to know." The admission created an alliance between them, Nina's medical expertise now extending to threat assessment, her role expanding from caretaker to guardian in ways that required trust neither had fully earned yet. She nodded slowly, accepting this shift with visible wariness. "The man outside, keep him away from the house. Whatever his purpose in your organization, his presence traumatizes her, and that's unacceptable if she's supposed to heal here." "Done," he agreed immediately, already mentally reassigning duties and explaining to his enforcer why he was being rotated off estate security. The conversation would raise questions he'd deflect, but Nina's observation had crystallized something he'd been avoiding. Isabella's recognition of the man who'd destroyed her world meant keeping him close was cruelty disguised as protection. Nina left the study with shoulders squared, walking back toward Isabella's room where the girl played with increasing normalcy as physical health returned, even while emotional wounds remained fresh. He stayed at the window watching his enforcer, seeing him now through Isabella's eyes, not as loyal soldier, but as the architect of her nightmares, the face she'd seen that night when the world ended. His phone buzzed with routine business, decisions awaiting his input on matters that weeks ago would have consumed his full attention. Now they felt distant, less urgent than the domestic crisis unfolding in his own home, less important than keeping a 6-year-old safe from shadows that wore his organization's uniform. That evening, he issued orders through careful channels, reassigning his enforcer to distant operations that would keep him away from the estate indefinitely. The man accepted without question, trained obedience preventing inquiry into sudden changes, but others in his inner circle would notice the shift and draw their own conclusions about why a trusted lieutenant was being distanced from their boss's primary residence. Let them wonder, he thought, watching the enforcer's car disappear through the gates for the last time. Some things mattered more than maintaining appearances or organizational hierarchy, and keeping Isabella from daily reminders of trauma was becoming one of them, whether or not it made strategic sense. The third week brought unexpected normalcy, Isabella's laughter returning in small doses as Nina coaxed her into activities that didn't require thinking about loss. They baked cookies in the industrial kitchen, transforming sterile spaces into something warm and flower-dusted, creating memories in a house designed to hold nothing so impermanent as joy or childhood. He'd find them in the library where Nina read Portuguese children's books she'd had delivered, Isabella curled against her side following along with pictures, even when the words moved too fast. The mansion was reshaping itself around their presence, staff adjusting schedules to accommodate a child's needs, rooms gaining purpose beyond expensive displays of wealth and power. But the peace was fragile, built on foundations he knew couldn't hold forever. Questions Nina had stopped asking, but not stopped thinking. Isabella's grief that would resurface in waves as she grew old enough to understand what she'd lost. And underneath everything, the truth that connected him to her tragedy, waiting to surface like a body that wouldn't stay buried. The afternoon it happened, started ordinarily enough, rain returning to Charleston with the persistence of a season that wouldn't release the city from its gray grip. Nina was preparing tea in the kitchen, while Isabella played in the living room, building castles from blocks his people had sourced with the same efficiency they applied to weapons acquisition and territory expansion. He was in his office reviewing reports when he heard it. Not a scream, but something worse. The sound of complete silence from a child who'd been humming moments before. His body moved before his mind processed the threat, crossing the hallway in seconds to find Isabella frozen at the window, her small body rigid as stone. Outside, barely visible through rain-streaked glass, stood a figure under the entrance awning, his enforcer, returned despite orders, lighting a cigarette with mechanical precision that suggested he was waiting for something. The man must have forgotten something, come back for equipment or final instructions. His presence purely coincidental and catastrophically timed. Isabella stood 3 feet from the window, one hand extended with finger pointing at the man below, with the unwavering certainty of recognition that couldn't be denied or explained away. Nina appeared behind him in the doorway, drawn by the same terrible silence that had pulled him from his office, her sharp intake of breath confirming she understood immediately what was happening. "Isabella?" Nina's voice came out carefully controlled, moving into the room slowly, as if approaching something wild and easily startled. But the girl didn't turn, didn't acknowledge anything except the figure outside, her finger still pointing in accusation or identification. Maybe both, as her mouth opened to speak words that would destroy the careful fiction they'd all been living. "The man who made my mom go," Isabella said in English heavily accented but perfectly clear, her child's vocabulary finding the only words she had for concepts like murder and loss and permanent absence. The phrase hung in the air, innocent and devastating, stripping away every carefully maintained pretense about coincidence and bad luck, and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nina's face went white, blood draining as understanding crashed over her like a wave she couldn't escape or deny. Her eyes moved from Isabella to him with an expression that combined horror and comprehension, seeing connections she'd suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm, pieces assembling into a picture that made her step backward involuntarily. "Works for you, Dawn," Isabella continued, using the title she'd heard guards use, applying it with a 6-year-old's logic that didn't understand the weight it carried or the truth it revealed. The words were simple, factual, delivered without emotion because she didn't fully grasp their implications, but they functioned like a detonation in the careful piece they'd constructed. The enforcer outside finished his cigarette, unaware of the destruction his presence had caused, and walked back to his car visible in the driveway. Isabella watched him go, with eyes that would probably see that face in nightmares for years, tracking his movement until the vehicle disappeared beyond the gates, then slowly lowering her pointing finger, as if exhausted by the effort of identification. Nina sank into a chair, her medical bag sliding from shoulders gone suddenly slack, her breathing coming fast and shallow like someone fighting panic through training and willpower. He remained standing, frozen between the two of them, the child who'd just confirmed his guilt, the woman who'd just watched every suspicion validated in the worst possible way. "Isabella," Nina finally said, her voice remarkably steady considering the circumstances, reverting to Portuguese for words that needed maternal softness even in crisis. The girl turned toward her, seeking comfort from the only parent figure she had left, seemingly unaware that she'd just detonated a bomb that would reshape every relationship in the house. Nina opened her arms and Isabella ran to them, seeking the security of the only person who'd shown her consistent care and protection. Over the child's head, Nina's eyes met his, no longer cautious or professional, but filled with something colder, harder, the look of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew, and finding only betrayal underneath. He backed toward the door, giving them space, his mind racing through implications and consequences he couldn't control or contain. The enforcer would need to disappear, not for organization purposes, but because his presence was poison to Isabella's recovery, his face a trigger for trauma that would never fully heal as long as she could see him. But deeper than tactical considerations was the bottomless pit of his own guilt, now witnessed and confirmed by the only two people whose opinions had started to matter. He'd saved Isabella from the immediate consequences of violence while being ultimately responsible for that violence, rescued her from a situation his orders had created, played savior to a tragedy he'd orchestrated. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, listening to Nina murmur comfort in Portuguese to a child who didn't understand what she'd revealed, but would carry the weight of it anyway. His phone buzzed. Business as usual, decisions needed, the empire requiring attention. But he couldn't make himself care about any of it compared to the domestic catastrophe unfolding behind that door. Minutes passed before Nina emerged, closing the door softly behind her. Isabella presumably settled with cartoons or books, or whatever distraction could make a 6-year-old forget seeing the man who'd destroyed her world. Nina's face had shifted from shock to something else. Calculation, maybe, or decision-making processes he couldn't read but recognized as dangerous. "She's right, isn't she?" Nina said. Not really a question, her voice flat with the effect of someone past the point of emotional response, operating on logic and facts. "That man works for you. He was there that night. Whatever happened to her mother, you're connected to it through him, through your business, through orders you gave or situations you created." He could have denied it, deployed the careful ambiguity that had protected him through decades of operations and investigations. But standing in this hallway with Nina's eyes cutting through him like scalpels, lies felt more insulting than silence. "Yes," he said simply, the admission costing him something he couldn't name, confirming what they both already knew. "My organization was securing territory that night. There was resistance. She was collateral damage." The clinical term sounded obscene, applied to a woman who'd left to get medicine and never returned, reducing human tragedy to the language of acceptable losses and strategic necessities. Nina's jaw clenched, hands forming fists at her sides as she processed confirmation of suspicions that were easier to live with than certainties. "You knew this whole time," she said, the words carrying accusation and betrayal. "When you brought her here, when you hired me, when we told her about her mother, you knew." "I suspected from the location," he corrected, the distinction meaningless but honest, the difference between knowledge and terrible certainty. "I didn't know for sure until my people confirmed the casualty report. By then she was already here, already your patient, already part of this household in ways I couldn't reverse without causing more harm." Nina laughed, sharp and bitter, the sound foreign coming from someone who'd been gentle and careful for 3 weeks. "So your solution was to keep the truth buried, to let her trust you, bond with you, see you as her protector while the man who killed her mother collected a paycheck with your signature?" Her voice rose with each word, anger breaking through professional composure that had lasted until this moment. "My solution was to keep her alive," he countered, his own voice hardening with defensiveness he had no right to feel. "To give her medical care, safety, protection from a system that would have put her in facilities where children disappear or get damaged in different ways. I can't undo what happened, but I could prevent more harm." "By lying?" Nina shot back, stepping closer with courage that should have warned him away, but instead made him respect her more. "By having her live under the same roof as the man responsible for her trauma? By letting her call you Dawn like you're some benevolent figure instead of the person whose empire killed her mother?" Each question landed like a physical blow, accurate and devastating, stripping away every justification he'd constructed. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by rain against windows, and both their ragged breathing, two people standing at a crossroads that would determine a child's future, and possibly their own. Nina's eyes held his, demanding truth or confrontation, or maybe both, waiting for him to defend the indefensible, or finally admit to depths of wrongdoing he'd been minimizing. "You're right," he said finally, the words like swallowing glass, tearing his throat on the way out. "About all of it. I knew the risks, knew the connections, and I made decisions that prioritized what I could control over what I should have disclosed. But if I could go back, knowing what I know now," he paused, searching for honesty in a life built on calculated deception, "I'd still bring her here, because the alternative was worse." Nina shook her head slowly, processing this admission that wasn't quite apology or justification, but something in between. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing immediate tactics and long-term strategy. Isabella's future, and Nina's own continued presence in this morally complicated arrangement. "Do you disappear the man she identified? Add him to casualty lists alongside the woman he killed?" The accusation stung because it was accurate. His first instinct had been exactly that, removing problems through permanent solutions his world normalized. But that sounded barbaric when spoken aloud by someone from the other side of society's invisible line. "He'll be gone," he confirmed, not specifying how or to where, maintaining operational ambiguity out of habit. "Not because it fixes anything, but because Isabella can't heal if she sees him every day." "And us?" Nina pressed, gesturing between them an emotion that encompassed the fragile alliance they'd built over 3 weeks of shared caretaking. "Do I stay, knowing what I know? Keep caring for a child traumatized by your business while pretending we're building something healthy here? Or do I take her and leave, try to navigate the system you claim would damage her worse than staying with her mother's killer?" The choice she presented was impossible by design. No good options, only gradations of harm and complicity. "I can't make that decision for you," he said, hating the helplessness in his own voice, the admission that money and power meant nothing against one woman's moral judgment. "But if you go, do it knowing I'll ensure she's cared for, protected, given every advantage my resources can provide." Nina's expression suggested how little she trusted his promises, how completely the last 5 minutes had demolished whatever fragile faith she'd placed in his intentions. "Your resources killed her mother," she said bluntly, the words stripping away euphemism to expose raw truth underneath. "Why would I trust them to raise her daughter?" Because there were no better options, he wanted to say. Because the world was complicated and messy, and sometimes survival meant accepting help from flawed sources. But before he could formulate response, Nina turned back toward Isabella's door, her hand on the knob as she spoke over her shoulder with finality that suggested decisions already made. "I'm staying," she said, surprising him with the declaration that felt like both victory and defeat. "Not because I forgive you or because I think this situation is acceptable, but because Isabella needs consistency, and I'm the only person she trusts completely right now." But things change, starting immediately. She faced him fully, and he saw the transformation. No longer cautious employee, but something closer to equal, claiming authority through moral high ground he couldn't contest. "That man never sets foot on this property again," she continued, ticking off demands on her fingers with nurse's precision. "You establish a trust fund for Isabella's future that I oversee, that she can access when she's 18 regardless of what happens here. And you tell me the truth from now on. All of it. No more discoveries that rewrite what I think I understand." Her eyes held his, daring him to refuse terms that were more ultimatum than negotiation. "Agreed," he said simply, accepting conditions that would have been unthinkable weeks ago, before a rain-soaked child had reshaped his priorities in ways he was still processing. "Anything else?" Nina considered, her gaze assessing what other demands might be extracted from someone who'd revealed himself willing to renegotiate power dynamics for a child's well-being. "She gets therapy," Nina added after a pause, this demand softer, but no less firm. "Professional help from someone who specializes in childhood trauma, someone outside your organization who can be honest with her in ways we can't. She deserves space to process this with people who aren't implicated in the events that destroyed her life." The requirement was logical, necessary, and represented trust in outsiders he'd spent decades avoiding. "I'll arrange it," he promised, already considering how to vet therapists through channels that wouldn't compromise security while meeting Nina's requirement for genuine help. Discreet but qualified, someone who can handle complex situations without judgment that would harm her recovery. Nina nodded acceptance of this compromise, her posture finally relaxing fractionally from the rigid confrontation stance she'd held. "And one more thing," she said, her voice dropping to something quieter, more personal than the professional demands preceding it. "You need to tell her yourself. Explain your connection to what happened. Let her decide if she can live with it. She's 6, But she's already survived more than most adults, and she deserves honesty even if it's painful. The request asked him to be vulnerable with a child, to risk rejection from someone whose opinion shouldn't matter in his world, but somehow did. When? He asked, the single word carrying all his dread of that conversation, of seeing whatever fragile connection he'd built with Isabella dissolve under the weight of truth. Nina considered, calculating what Isabella could handle and when, balancing immediate honesty against a traumatized child's capacity for more devastating revelations, so soon after learning about her mother's death. Not today, she decided, relief flooding through him at the temporary reprieve. She's processing too much already, but soon, within days, not weeks. The longer we wait, the worse the betrayal feels when she finally understands. Nina's wisdom came from professional experience with trauma victims, from understanding that delayed truth often wounded deeper than immediate pain honestly delivered. They stood in the hallway, two people who'd become unlikely allies in circumstances neither had planned for or wanted, bound together by responsibility for a child neither had created, but both now felt compelled to protect. Outside, the rain continued its assault on Charleston, washing streets clean of everything except memory and consequence, the weather that had brought them all together persisting like a reminder that some storms never fully passed. That night, he sat in his office making calls that would reshape his organization's structure. The enforcer reassigned to operations 3 states away, where he'd be valuable but distant. Security protocols adjusted to ensure no one traumatic to Isabella would work anywhere near the estate. Each decision carved away pieces of efficiency and control he'd built over decades, sacrificing operational advantage for domestic peace he'd never prioritized before. His second-in-command asked careful questions about the sudden changes, reading between lines in ways that suggested the inner circle already suspected something unusual was happening in their boss's personal life. He offered no explanations, using authority to shut down inquiry while knowing rumors would spread anyway, the untouchable leader going soft, priorities shifting in ways that made veterans nervous about organizational direction. Let them worry, he thought, signing documents that established Isabella's trust fund with provisions Nina had specified, legal protections that would survive his death or imprisonment or whatever fate eventually caught him. The paperwork made it real, commitment to a child who'd entered his life by accident, but whose future had become his responsibility through moral debt he could never fully repay. Nina found him past midnight, still working through logistics of changed security and financial arrangements, her presence in his office doorway unexpected and somehow welcome, despite earlier confrontation. "She's asking for you," Nina said without preamble, the statement carrying weight beyond its surface meaning. She woke up from nightmares and said she wanted Dawn. The title sounded different in Nina's voice now, no longer neutral observation but laden with all the complicated truth they'd discussed. He followed her upstairs to find Isabella sitting up in bed clutching her teddy bear, eyes wide with residual fear from whatever her sleeping mind had conjured. She reached for him immediately when he appeared, small arms extending with trust that felt undeserved, and he crossed the room to sit on the bed's edge, letting her curl against his side like she'd done with Nina countless times. "Bad dream?" he asked in English she was learning to understand better each day, his arm around her small shoulders feeling simultaneously natural and terrifying. She nodded against his chest, her Portuguese explanation too rapid for his limited understanding, but Nina translated from the doorway with gentle voice that made even nightmare description sound less frightening. She saw the man again, and he was looking for her. His chest tightened at the thought of Isabella's subconscious processing today's recognition, fear burrowing deeper, because now she knew the threat had a face and a connection to her current life. "He won't find you," he promised, the words feeling inadequate against a child's justified terror of someone who'd destroyed her world. "He's gone now, far away where he can't come to this house or anywhere near you." Isabella looked up at him with those assessing eyes that seemed older than 6 years, evaluating his promise with a seriousness that suggested she'd already learned adult lessons about empty reassurances. Then she did something that cracked the careful shell he'd maintained around his heart. She smiled, small and tired, but genuine, and settled back against him with the complete trust of someone who'd decided to believe, despite every reason not to. Nina watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable in the low light, as he sat with Isabella until her breathing evened into sleep. He remained there longer than necessary, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, feeling the weight of responsibility he'd accepted without fully understanding its cost or duration, wondering how a man who'd built an empire on violence had ended up as the guardian of its smallest victim. When he finally extracted himself carefully to avoid waking her, Nina still stood in the hallway, arms crossed but face softer than during their confrontation hours earlier. "She trusts you," Nina observed, the statement neither praise nor condemnation but simple fact that complicated everything. "Despite what your world did to her, despite the connection she doesn't fully understand yet, she feels safe with you. That makes one of us," he admitted, allowing vulnerability he rarely showed to anyone. The confession of someone realizing he was in over his head in ways that couldn't be fixed through usual methods. Nina's expression shifted towards something that might have been understanding, and for a moment they stood in shared acknowledgement of the impossible situation they'd all committed to navigating together. Days later, Isabella played in the gardens under Nina's watchful supervision, her laughter carrying through open windows as Charleston's weather finally cleared into something resembling spring. He watched from his office, phone calls and business forgotten in favor of observing a child who shouldn't be happy, but was finding moments of joy anyway, resilient in ways that humbled him completely. The future remained uncertain, truth still to be revealed, consequences still unfolding, the question of whether redemption was even possible for someone with his history. But as Isabella's laughter reached him through glass and distance, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps giving one child safety and care might not erase his sins, but could at least write a different ending than the one he'd been heading toward before a storm brought them together. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you these stories. This tale of redemption and responsibility continues to unfold, and your engagement keeps it alive.